Okay, welcome in guys. Professor Zeeb here. We're going to go over our next concept here, which is the development of the self in early childhood. And we're going to look at some classic studies here and some milestones and things like that. So let's get to it here. Okay, so development of the self, we really think this sort of takes off during early childhood. And we're going to look at a classic study to kind of kick this one off. Okay, so we go to the study by Lewis, Brooks, and Gunn. This goes back to the late 70s. And remember, when we're working with young children, it's hard to ask them these sort of deep, cognitively deep type questions in terms of the self. So they got a little creative with this one, even going back to infancy in this particular study. What they would do is they would place a child in front of a mirror and they would put a little bit of lipstick on their nose or some ladies' rouge. In other words, the point is there's a red dot on their nose. And if they put the child in front of the mirror and they react to that, that understands or that demonstrates that they understand this is me and there's something wrong with my appearance. Because remember, part of the self is recognizing who you are in terms of what you look like and sort of having some kind of recognition in that area. So in other words, they took children of various ages and would place them in front of a mirror with this dot on their nose to see if they would notice that something's wrong. So theoretically, if there was no reaction, then they're not understanding that that's me in the reflection, and thus the self is not quite defined, not quite developed yet. But if there's a big reaction or they try to rub it off, that demonstrates that, wow, that is me. I understand that's me, and there's something wrong with my appearance. All right, so let's take a look at some of our milestones here. So once again, we think this sort of progresses in these sort of steps or stages. So about 5 to 8 months, they found that children at this age, a young infant, obviously, did not know that they were looking at themselves in the mirror. In other words, there was no reaction to the dot. Sometimes they would wave to the image as if it was another person or, react in terms of that's another human being. Really, what we're saying is that there's no sense of self at this time. They're not recognizing that this is actually me and there's something wrong. They get a little bit older, 9 to 12 months. Now, we see a little bit of change here. They're still not recognizing themselves yet. So the sense of self is not developed yet, but they would start to turn towards objects reflected in the mirror, which is a big step in understanding how the mirror works. They may actually reach out to touch themselves in the mirror, which they didn't see before, but still no reaction to the red dot. So thus, once again, we would say that there's no sense of self developed. It's just not quite there. All right, so the key seems to be around 15 to 18 months, where now children are showing signs of self-recognition. So in this particular case, children of this age would react to that red dot when they saw themselves in the mirror and would even point to their nose afterwards, showing that, wow, there's something wrong here. This is my actual nose and there's a red dot on my nose. This is part of me. This is who I am. That's sort of showing the glimmers of the beginning of recognition of the self or the development of the self. Some of the children would actually try to rub it off, which shows that they understand that's me. There's something wrong here. It shows that they have an awareness of their unique appearance in this particular case. So we could safely say around that time, the sense of self-understanding has been established. Now we're going to go a little bit older, 21 to 24 months. Now it's starting to develop even further. So they found children of this age would use their own names in reference to that image, or even personal pronouns such as I and me, which is further demonstrating that they're understanding this is me. This is my appearance, and I have a sort of an indication of what the self actually is. Not only that, if they place 2 infants in front of the mirror, they could correctly identify themselves and compare it to the other reflection of the other child. Once again, that's showing that I have unique features that are different from other people, and I'm able to pick those out. So that's showing further development of the self. Okay, so by this time, we would expect them to clearly be able to distinguish themselves, especially when they're sitting next to another child and both images are being reflected in the mirror. By age 4, they're able to use self-evaluations. We think one of the reasons this takes off, especially when they get to preschool, is something called social comparison. Children of this age, possibly daily, are comparing themselves to other children, whether it's their ability, what they look like, their gender, for example. So we think that those social comparisons really enables the development of the self to take off. And now it becomes more refined. They're learning that I'm the same, the same as you in certain areas, but I'm different. And that's what makes me unique from other people, that kind of thing. So we think social comparison plays a big part as children come around other children of similar age, as an example, like in preschool, and certainly when they get to elementary school. Okay, so now we're going to look at how the developing self changes over time. Just once again, some different points to kind of consider. So we think that after infancy, as we get into early childhood here, that children really take the next step in self-development and self-understanding. As their cognitive skills increase, so their thinking skills are getting better, they're able to develop deeper insights into themselves, and that allows them to make these leaps and bounds in the development of the self. So they're understanding how the world works, but also how I work and how I'm different from people and that kind of thing. It turns out that young children, in regard to the self, pretty typically use physical descriptions, possessions, physical activities to understand themselves and use that as a descriptor. In other words, if we asked a young child about 3 or so, who are you? What is the self in their terms? They would typically say things like, I have brown hair, I'm a boy, I like soccer, I'm good at math, that kind of thing. So they often use those types of descriptors, more physical type stuff, to sort of explain themselves and understand what the self actually means, okay? And part of this is their advancing development in language. So as their language starts to sort of take off during this time, as we said before, they're able to use more elaborate descriptions of themselves, in this particular case, more physical type stuff. We really think that these descriptors of the self, or understandings of the self at this time, definitely can be unrealistic and overly positive. So, think of your typical 3 or 4-year-old when they're describing themselves. They often flood those descriptions with positive attributes, such as I'm a good child, I am happy. So we think a lot of them have this sort of positive flavor or positive influence in terms of how they describe themselves. And we think there's some reasons for that. Possibly because they're comparing themselves to a younger age, and obviously they're going to be better than they were a year ago. So for example, if they say, wow, I'm good at math, I'm a really good math person, well, 2 years ago, they may not have been able to even conceive that. So it appears that they actually are getting better, and thus I am that person. So we think that they often have these positive self-evaluations that are not quite rooted in reality due to that reason. So once again, we think they compare them to earlier abilities when they were younger. So of course they've improved, and it gives this illusion that they've actually become better, okay? It also could be their cognitive sort of understanding of what the self is, that the self could be changed very easily, just as effort could be. Obviously, we think, in most cases, the self is relatively stable in terms of things like personality and interests, and certainly those could change, but there is a stability component to that. However, young children view the world very differently, so just as my effort can change things, certainly myself could change along the same lines. So we think that often leads to this sort of unrealistic rooting of the self during this time that children are classic for. All right, so this will conclude our short lecture about the self. Please go on to the next section or part of the class there.